Shivapriya. Sir, this is for Sri Mohan Guruswamy. Srinidhi, we welcome Dr. Jay Prakash Narayana. Welcome Sanjay ji. Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Chairman and friends, I am no expert in foreign policy. Now, some 2,400 years ago, a disciple of Socrates had a similar dilemma, sitting in the midst of a galaxy of very distinguished scholars and practitioners. One day, this disciple stood up and said, "Master, for 20 years I listened to you and my colleagues discuss on a variety of topics, but I never once opened my mouth. Was it right or was it wrong?" Socrates, the great philosopher that he was, he said, "If you are a wise man, then you are a fool. If you are a fool, then you are a wise man." It took me also some time to decipher. What he meant was, if you are a wise man anyway, if what you say has some consequence to fellow human beings, you are a fool in having concealed your wisdom. If you are a fool anyway, and if what you say means nothing to anybody else, you are a wise man in concealing your ignorance. Now, the challenge before me now is to conceal my ignorance. Let me therefore, I've gone through the book, very erudite, very insightful, very scholarly, very instructive for those of us who are somewhat uninitiated in foreign policy. But let me take a slightly different approach. Sometimes, if you don't look at the way a sausage is made, you probably enjoy it more. If you view it from a 50,000 feet aerial bird's eye view, if you also take a long sweep of history rather than contemporary events, maybe we get a better sense of things. Victor Hugo, in a very celebrated book on the eve of the 20th century, the book is called The Future of Man. He said, in the 20th century, war will be dead. Scaffold wall will be dead. In the 20th century, there will be but one country for all. That country, the planet Earth. There will be but one hope for all. That hope, the whole heaven itself. Well, we all know what happened in 20th century. But if you really take a long sweep of history, I think some of his dreams are actually coming true. I may appear to be very naive, very romantic, and very optimistic. I plead guilty of being an optimist. I'm a glass half full kind of a guy. But if you take a broad view of history, we have come a great distance. Long road ahead, there's no doubt about it. We're a work in progress, as Ambassador Srinivasan said. But we certainly, as mankind, as global community, for a variety of reasons, not necessarily idealism, we are sometimes confused between idealism and values. We are sometimes assuming that values and interests are necessarily antithetical. Mr. Mohan Guruswamy is a very distinguished scholar and thinker and a very experienced person. But poor Germany, when do they get it right? If they reject the immigrants, then no values. If they accept immigrants, no values is self-interest. When are the values then manifest? If values and self-interest coincide, what do we have against that? I would argue that the world is moving in a direction not because of idealism, not because of the goodness of the heart, but because of the practical, robust common sense that allows us to fuse values with interests. And I'm okay with that. If you take the two broad streams that the book mentioned repeatedly, the solidarists and the pluralists, or the universalists and the nationalists or isolationists, let's say. This really is a spectrum. Very rarely is a country truly universalist. Very rarely is a country truly isolationist. There are, of course, a few exceptions. Perhaps Scandinavia today, perhaps Denmark, perhaps the Netherlands. I have a little bit of bias for Netherlands, therefore I would include that in this universalist space. Perhaps some of these nations are truly universalist in their aspirations and behavior. If you take isolationist, perhaps North Korea is the only truly isolationist country in the world today. There were a few in the past 60, 70 years in our living memory. We all remember Pol Pot's Cambodia. They cannot be more isolationist or more heinous or more disgusting in perhaps all of modern history at least. We remember Taliban's Afghanistan. We remember apartheid South Africa. Some people may take umbrage with what I say next. We remember Mao Zedong's China, at least for part of the period, fiercely isolationist. Much more recently, Mugabe's Zimbabwe for some period, Idi Amin's Uganda, and I think that fellow's name is Bashir's Sudan for some time. But these are exceptions. very often we fall somewhere in between in this whole spectrum. The trend, in my judgment, is a movement from isolationism to universalism. Even a country like China, fiercely isolationist until the 1970s, who would have imagined that today it is the champion of global trade and champion of fighting global warming? I'm not saying it's out of the goodness of the hearts of the Chinese, but the Chinese understood the way forward for their country economically and in terms of global influence. If that coincides with global good, all power to their elbow. I don't think we need to necessarily view both these antagonistic interests and values. Technology, trade, a sense of human rights. Again, not too long ago in 1989, China had no compunctions in mowing down about 8,000 people, estimated, in Tiananmen Square. But see what's happening in the past several weeks in Hong Kong. It's remarkable. I think democratic India cannot claim that we handle our protests with such a degree of decorum and minimal violence. Now, what are the reasons? China may want an enhanced image. China may realize that any precipitous action in Hong Kong actually hurts their national interests. I don't think we should look too far into motives when the action is right. The fact that nation states are increasingly compelled or feel compelled to move in a direction which we all feel good about, I think is where the true story is. The notion of non-aggression. In the post-Second World War world, there are very few cases of real aggression, and there is almost none where there is actual invasion for territory. China certainly did invade temporarily Vietnam in 1979. I remember Vajpayee was in Beijing at that time, and China actually said, when Vajpayee was on their soil, we will teach Vietnam a lesson like we taught to India in 62. But they went back. American invasions talked about, but they went back. There was no territorial conquest. We ourselves went into Bangladesh, but we liberated and came out. We did not even know, in a fit of, I don't know what really, romanticism, idealism, forgetfulness. Mrs. Gandhi, the consummate real politician, did not even insist on a written agreement on Kashmir border. And that probably is the reason why we now have the festering problem. Otherwise, in 71, after that massive sacrifice of Indian armed forces, given the force of circumstances, the problem could have been solved. It was, in a very peculiar way, the goodness of the heart and excessive trust in not ensuring that the LOC becomes the national boundary. International law, again, notwithstanding China's brazen violation in the South China Sea. I mean, in the past 200 years, to the best of my recollection and knowledge, or understanding, and Ambassador Srinivasan must tell us, no country, none of the superpowers, neither the Dutch, nor the British, nor the American, even before the UN law of the seas was there, none of them violated what is now accepted as the UN law of the seas. China is the first global power that with impunity is violating the law of the seas. But that's still, I would say, an aberration. If you take the totality, it is a movement in the right direction. Non-proliferation, I think it's a remarkable tribute to the world in the post-Second World War world. That after the Soviet Union's dismemberment, whether it's in Belarus or Ukraine or in Kazakhstan, without much fuss, actually we could dismantle nuclear weapons. In general, mankind could contain the flow of nuclear weapons to many countries. It's not a small tribute. Or the common perception of terror threat in modern times, particularly with a complete perversion of religious tenets, but misusing the power of religion, and of course increasing capital flows. So whatever the reasons, today we live in a globalized world accepted as such by most of the people. A recognition that my national interests are not necessarily antithetical to the rest of the world's interests. It's not a zero-sum game. I think we should celebrate that. But there are also forces of isolationism. Certainly non-interference, particularly in Asia, non-invasion is one thing, but non-interference, even when your human rights are violated, you simply do all kinds of dirty things within your borders. That certainly is not what is right from a globalist or universal perspective. But we still stick to that, non-intervention. The notion of sovereignty, the archaic notion of balance of power, still prevailing in some quarters in the world, and of course the force of migration. Migration itself is leading to the obvious things. We all see now what's happening in Europe, what's happening in America, the racism, the xenophobia, and ultranationalism. And it certainly is leading to isolationism. Who would have thought even 10 years ago that America would be the champion of isolationism today? And of course, in certain contexts, geography. If you take the current situation, I would say there are three forces that are shaping contemporary world, but it's only temporary in my view. This whole populism and nationalism and isolationism that are now piloted are championed by the United States and embraced by many other countries increasingly, I think it's largely because of the unique set of circumstances of this perverted religion or religious perversion leading to extreme terrorism, giving a sense of threat to the global community. I would say it's a temporary aberration. I'm an optimist. Not too long ago, another Semitic religion, the Christianity, in the Middle Ages, went through a similar phase, except that we didn't call it terrorism. We didn't have a notion of modernity or nation-state system. But Islam is probably going through that phase today. And hopefully that phase will be accelerated given the modernity of communications and our ideas and thoughts. But certainly, it is one force that is shaping history today. The second is migration. But again, as Dr. Mohan Guruswamy said, a day will surely come, I'll mention that briefly later in my concluding remark, surely come when migration will be seen as an asset universally, not merely by Germany, by much of the rest of the world. And the third is, and this is perhaps the most enduring one, though the least talked about one today, the tremendous economic insecurity arising out of disruptive technological changes, what some people now are calling industrialization 4.0. The fusion of the physical, the digital, and the biological. Something dramatic is happening in front of our very eyes. Perhaps within the next decade, at the very least within the next generation, we will not be able to recognize the world of the future relative to even the world of today. And that certainly has political, social, and global consequences. But I believe not all of this is negative. And I believe some of these things are only temporary. And I believe the world has the capacity and the good sense to recognize that the collective self-interest demands that we balance these and adjust to these new realities and take advantage of the best of them. Let me conclude. What does the future hold? I believe many of the changes of the past century or so, particularly past 70, 80 years, are irreversible. I believe they are changes for the better. Sometimes from the prism of our own local circumstances, things appear a little gloomy. But if you look at the bigger picture, and as I said, the long term, things actually appear pretty optimistic. Global communications, you like it or not, there is no way you can now curtail communication globally, unless you are willing to pay an enormous social and economic price. The aspirations which are now universal, our cultures may be different, our origins may be different, our religions may be different, but we wear the similar dress, we have similar aspirations, similar technology, similar hunger for goods, appetite for goods, and similar patterns of production. There is a universalization, you like it or not. The end of oil. Now, for the first time, I think we can say with confidence, the end of oil is now in sight, the oil era. In the next 10, 15 years, a dramatic change is taking place in the energy scene. That itself has profound consequences for the future. And many of them are positive. The global supply chains, the things we wear, the wristwatch or the mobile phone or the pen or the glasses that I wear, God knows where this is from China. Mobile phone is, I don't know where from. Huawei, I think this is China. There's something else is American, but made in China or something else. There's no way you can now isolate yourself. Not unless you want to go back to the Stone Age. It's a force beyond national control, unless you're a North Korea. Thank God, most of the world is not North Korea and will never be North Korea. And even North Korea will not remain North Korea for long. The population stabilization. One of the most hopeful stories now emerging from Africa, India to start with. India is already at 2.2 to 2.3 fertility rate. Within the next few years, we're going to touch that 2.1, that is population stabilization level. Within a generation, we're going to stabilize our population probably at 1.6 billion, now, which is big, but you can see light at the end of the tunnel. Africa is seeing dramatic declines in fertility. And probably the reasonable scenario now is about 9.6 billion or so, or 10 billion, will be the global population peaking, and then will stabilize and slowly decline. That's when migration will become an asset, will not be seen as a threat. Right now, with dramatic increase in populations in the poorer countries, migration is seen as a threat. But I think soon, within a generation, countries will realize migration could be an asset, like Germany has realized today. I know I'm painting a very hopeful picture, but all this, my belief is, it's not happening because of the goodness of our hearts. Let me conclude with this. It's not happening because we are all men and women of great values and sense of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all that. No. It's happening because of a pragmatic common sense. Let's take two figures of modern history, Napoleon Bonaparte and Hitler. Hitler was an idealist, quote unquote, in the political science language. Those who are not familiar with the political science language, they may find it shocking that Hitler is an idealist, but he was an idealist. He had a certain vision of society. Napoleon had no such ambitions. He was a soldier of fortune. He was a pragmatic power seeker. But Napoleon had an enduring influence on Europe and the world. In many ways, today's Europe, including European community, European common market, the Code Napoleon, many things are the heritage of Napoleon Bonaparte. He never had really grand notions of the world. He simply wanted to be in power, become the emperor of the revolution. A revolution that ended the empire, and yet he became the emperor. It's not necessarily the philosopher or the wise person or a moral person. It's a person with pragmatic common sense, a person or a society. That is what gives me hope, not belief in a Mahatma Gandhi, because you don't have Gandhis. You have Gandhi once in 1,000 years. But I believe we have plenty of people who are potential Napoleon Bonapartes. I believe robust common sense, where fusion of your naked self-interest with a sense of the future and the values is common, and it's already happening in the world. And therefore, Victor Hugo's dream is probably closer to fulfillment today than ever before. I think this book gives us a fantastic opportunity to look at ourselves as mankind and as nation states. But let's not forget the whole nation state story is just about 200 years old. Essentially, it's a construct of the 19th century, though there were underpinnings before that. In the long history of human civilization, this is just but a blip. I don't think we should really judge ourselves as mankind by this short period of history. I think we're moving in the right direction. I think technological forces, economic imperatives, and our own sense of enlightened self-interest is driving us inevitably to a better world, more quote-unquote moral world, with values that actually make a difference to our lives. Thank you very much.